If you're enjoying this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories from the frontier. Now, let's dive into our story. The sun hung low over Deadwood Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Saloon doors creaked in the evening breeze as horses tied to hitching posts stomped restlessly. Inside Murphy's saloon, the air was thick with cigar smoke, and the sound of clinking glasses mixed with rough laughter from cowboys fresh off the trail. Thomas Hawthorne sat alone at his usual corner table, nursing a whiskey that had grown warm in his weathered hands. At 42, his face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much sorrow. His dark hair, streaked with premature grey, hung slightly over eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. 3 years had passed since consumption took his wife Mary and their infant son. Since then, Thomas had become a ghost in his own life, working his small ranch by day and sitting in this same corner each night, watching the world move around him while he remained frozen in time. The piano player struck up a lively tune as the evening crowd began to filter in. Cowboys, miners, and traveling merchants filled the tables, their voices rising above the music. Thomas barely noticed them anymore. He had become furniture in this place, as permanent and unremarkable as the wooden beams overhead. But tonight would be different. Tonight, fate would shake Thomas from his stupor in the most unexpected way. Ruby Martinez moved between the tables with practiced grace, her red dress swishing as she carried drinks and dodged wandering hands with the skill of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous waters. At 19, she possessed a beauty that could stop conversation, but her green eyes held a wariness that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. She had been working at Murphy's for 6 months, sending most of her earnings back to her ailing mother in Santa Fe. The work wasn't what she had dreamed of as a child, but it kept food on her mother's table and medicine within reach. Ruby had learned to smile through the catcalls and deflect unwanted advances with humor and quick wit. As she approached a table of rowdy cattle drivers, one of them grabbed her wrist roughly. The man's breath reeked of whiskey, and his grip left white marks on her pale skin. Ruby tried to pull away, but his fingers tightened like a vice. The atmosphere in the saloon shifted instantly. Conversations died as heads turned toward the commotion. The piano player's fingers faltered on the keys. Even the bartender stopped polishing glasses to watch the scene unfold with the tension of a coiled rattlesnake. Thomas looked up from his drink for the first time in hours. Something about the girl's struggle pierced through the fog that had surrounded his heart for so long. Perhaps it was the way she held her chin high, despite her fear, or the desperate dignity in her green eyes that reminded him of someone he once knew. The cowboy yanked Ruby closer, his intentions clear to everyone in the room. She stumbled, nearly dropping her tray of drinks. The other men at the table laughed and encouraged their companion, their voices rising above the nervous silence that had fallen over the rest of the saloon. Thomas found himself standing before he realized he had made the decision to move. His chair scraped against the wooden floor as he rose, the sound cutting through the tension like a blade. He had been silent for so long that many of the regular patrons had forgotten the sound of his voice. He walked across the room with measured steps, his boots echoing on the scarred floorboards. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing the change in the air. Thomas had the build of a man who had spent years working cattle and breaking horses, and there was something in his bearing that commanded respect without demanding it. The cowboy holding Ruby looked up as Thomas approached, his bloodshot eyes narrowing with drunken belligerence. He was a big man himself, with arms like tree trunks and hands that had probably broken their share of bones. But there was something about the quiet stranger that made him hesitate. Thomas stopped just within arm's reach and spoke in a voice that was low, but carried clearly across the silent room. His words were simple and direct, with no trace of bluster or threat. He simply asked the man to release the girl and return to his drinking. For a moment it seemed the cowboy might comply. His grip on Ruby's wrist loosened slightly, and she took a small step backward. But then his companions began to jeer, calling him names and questioning his courage. The alcohol in his system flared his temper, and he tightened his hold on Ruby once more. What happened next lasted only seconds, but would be talked about in Deadwood Creek for years to come. Thomas moved with the swift precision of a man who had once been a cavalry officer, his hand shooting out to break the cowboy's grip, while simultaneously positioning himself between the man and Ruby. The cowboy swung wildly, his fist cutting through the air where Thomas's head had been a moment before. Thomas responded with a short, sharp blow that sent the bigger man stumbling backward into his chair. The other cowboys at the table started to rise, but something in Thomas's eyes made them think better of it. The fallen cowboy struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip. He reached for the gun at his hip, but Thomas was already there, his own weapon drawn with the smooth speed of long practice. The barrel of his Colt .45 pointed steadily at the cowboy's chest, unwavering despite the chaos around them. The standoff lasted an eternity compressed into heartbeats. The entire saloon held its breath, waiting to see which way the scales would tip. But the cowboy, even through his drunken haze, recognized the look of a man who had killed before and would do so again, if necessary. Slowly he raised his hands and backed away. Thomas holstered his weapon and turned to check on Ruby. She stood frozen behind him, her face pale, but her eyes bright with something that might have been gratitude or simply shock. He asked quietly if she was hurt, and she shook her head, finding her voice long enough to whisper her thanks. The incident might have ended there, with Thomas returning to his corner table and Ruby continuing her work. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As the crowd began to disperse and normal conversation resumed, a new group of men pushed through the batwing doors. These were not cowboys or miners. They wore the dusty clothes of men who had been riding hard for days, and their eyes held the cold calculation of professional killers. The leader was a thin man with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from some long-ago knife fight. They called themselves the Torino Gang, and they had been terrorizing small towns across 3 territories for the better part of 2 years. Bank robberies, cattle rustling, and murder followed in their wake like vultures circling carrion. Deadwood Creek had been fortunate to avoid their attention until now. The scarred leader's eyes swept the room with predatory interest before settling on Ruby. He had heard about the beautiful Saloon girl from contacts in other towns, and he had come to collect what he considered his due. The local law consisted of one aging sheriff who was more undertaker than peace officer. Ruby recognized the danger immediately. She had heard whispers of the Torino Gang from other working girls who had encountered them in their travels. The stories they told were enough to make even the bravest woman consider a different line of work. Her hand trembled as she set down her tray. The gang leader approached Ruby with the confidence of a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted. He introduced himself with mock courtesy, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone who had fallen far from genteel origins. He made his intentions clear with words that would have made a dock worker blush. Thomas watched from his corner as the scene unfolded. Every instinct told him to mind his own business, to finish his drink and walk away. He had already risked enough for one evening, and these men were clearly more dangerous than drunken cowboys. But something about Ruby's terror called to a part of him he thought had died with his family. As the gang leader reached for Ruby, Thomas rose from his chair once more. This time the entire gang turned to look at him, hands drifting toward their weapons. The odds were 5 to 1, and everyone in the room knew it. The other patrons began edging toward the exits, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. Thomas walked forward with the same measured pace he had used before, but now there was something different in his bearing. The grief that had weighed him down for 3 years had been replaced by a cold purpose that burned like winter fire. He had found something worth fighting for again. The confrontation that followed would become legend in the frontier towns. Thomas moved through the gang like a force of nature, his years of military training combining with the desperate strength of a man with nothing left to lose. Tables overturned, glasses shattered, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the night. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the gang members lay motionless on the sawdust-covered floor. The leader had escaped with a bullet in his shoulder, dragging 1 wounded companion with him. They would not be returning to Deadwood Creek anytime soon, if ever. Thomas stood amid the wreckage, his shirt torn and blood trickling from a cut above his left eye. But he was alive, and more importantly, so was Ruby. She stared at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief, unable to process what had just happened. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by the sound of gunfire. He took one look at the scene and decided that justice had already been served. The survivors told their stories, painting Thomas as a hero who had saved them all from the notorious gang. But Thomas felt no pride in what he had done. As he walked Ruby home through the quiet streets, he found himself thinking not of the men he had killed, but of the girl walking beside him. There was something about her courage in the face of danger that reminded him of his late wife's strength. Ruby lived in a small room above the general store, barely large enough for a bed and a washstand. As they reached her door, she invited Thomas in for coffee, wanting to thank him properly for what he had done. Her hands shook as she lit the oil lamp, casting dancing shadows on the plain wooden walls. They sat across from each other at her tiny table, drinking coffee that was stronger than either of them preferred. Ruby talked nervously about her life, her mother's illness, and her dreams of someday opening a dress shop. Thomas listened without judgment, finding peace in her voice after years of silence. As the night wore on, Ruby's nervous chatter gave way to comfortable quiet. She studied Thomas's weathered face in the lamplight, seeing past the grief to the good man underneath. There was kindness in his eyes despite all he had suffered, and she found herself trusting him in a way she had never trusted anyone before. Thomas, for his part, felt something awakening in his chest that he had thought was dead forever. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of caring for another human being. Ruby's presence filled spaces in his heart that had been empty for so long he had forgotten they existed. When he finally rose to leave, Ruby caught his hand. She asked quietly if he would come by the next evening, not as a customer, but as a friend. Thomas hesitated, part of him wanting to retreat back into the safety of his isolation, but something in her green eyes made him nod his agreement. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet conversations and shared meals. Thomas began taking his evening drink at the table nearest to where Ruby worked, watching over her without being obvious about it. She, in turn, saved her brightest smiles for him, finding excuses to linger at his table whenever her duties allowed. The other patrons of Murphy's Saloon began to notice the change in both of them. Thomas spoke more, smiled occasionally, and even laughed at some of the cowboys' jokes. Ruby seemed lighter somehow, as if a burden she had carried for months was finally lifting from her shoulders. But their growing friendship was tested when Ruby collapsed during her shift one evening. She had been feeling unwell for days, but had continued working, unable to afford the loss of income. Thomas carried her to the doctor's office, his heart pounding with fear that he might lose someone else he cared about. The doctor was a kindly man named Samuel Hartwell, who had seen every kind of ailment the frontier could produce. After examining Ruby, he emerged from his office with news that would change both their lives forever. Ruby was pregnant, he announced, probably about 2 months along. The revelation hit both Thomas and Ruby like a thunderbolt. She had suspected, but hadn't dared hope, having learned not to trust in good things. The father was a traveling salesman who had promised to marry her before disappearing into the night with her savings and her innocence. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet as memories of his own wife's pregnancy came flooding back. The joy, the anticipation, The devastating loss when both mother and child were taken by the same disease that had nearly claimed Ruby's life as well. But this time was different. This time he had a chance to protect someone. Ruby wept that night, not from shame but from fear. She knew what happened to unmarried women with children in frontier towns. She would lose her job, her reputation, and likely her room above the general store. Her mother's medicine would go unpurchased, and both she and her child would face a future of desperate poverty. Thomas sat with her through her tears, holding her hand and speaking words of comfort he hadn't used in years. As dawn broke over Deadwood Creek, he made a decision that surprised them both. He asked Ruby to marry him, not out of pity, but out of genuine caring and a desire to build something good from the wreckage of their separate sorrows. Ruby stared at him in shock, searching his face for signs of obligation or charity, but what she saw there was steady determination and the beginnings of something deeper. Thomas explained that he had a ranch outside of town, small but profitable, with room enough for a family. He promised to be a good husband and father, to protect both her and the child she carried. The proposal was practical rather than romantic, but it offered Ruby something she had never had before: security and respectability. More than that, it offered her child a father and a name. She accepted with tears of gratitude, knowing that Thomas was offering her far more than she could ever give him in return. They were married 3 days later, in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher. Ruby wore a blue dress borrowed from the doctor's wife, and Thomas had traded his usual work clothes for a black suit that had belonged to his father. There were no flowers or wedding cake, but there was hope. The ranch house was larger than Ruby had expected, built of solid timber with a stone chimney and glass windows that caught the morning light. It had been empty for too long, Thomas explained, but it would come alive again with a woman's touch and the sound of children's laughter. Thomas was a man of his word in every respect. He treated Ruby with gentle courtesy, never pressing for more than she was ready to give. He prepared the spare bedroom for her use, promising that their marriage would progress at whatever pace felt right to both of them. His patience and kindness began to heal wounds that Ruby had thought would never mend. As Ruby's pregnancy progressed, Thomas found himself transformed by the prospect of fatherhood. He repaired the crib he had built for his first child, sanded away the dust of grief, and painted it fresh white. He read books about childbirth and infant care, determined not to be caught unprepared this time. Ruby, for her part, flourished under Thomas's protection. The constant fear and weariness that had marked her features began to fade, replaced by the healthy glow of a woman well cared for. She took over the household with efficient grace, cooking meals that filled the house with warmth and keeping the floors so clean they gleamed. The townspeople of Deadwood Creek watched the transformation with interest and approval. Thomas Hawthorne, the grief-stricken widower who had barely spoken for 3 years, was becoming human again. Ruby, the saloon girl who had endured whispers and stares, was now a respectable married woman carrying herself with quiet dignity. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. Thomas and Ruby spent long evenings by the fireplace, he reading aloud from books of poetry while she mended clothes or knitted tiny garments for the baby. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with mutual understanding rather than awkwardness. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Ruby felt the first strong movement from the child within her. She gasped and placed her hand on her swollen belly, her eyes wide with wonder. Thomas looked up from his book, concerned until he saw her smile. She reached for his hand and placed it beside hers, both of them holding their breath until the baby moved again. The feeling of that small life stirring beneath his palm broke something open in Thomas's chest. All the love he had buried with his first family came rushing back, stronger than before, because it had been tested by loss. He looked into Ruby's shining eyes and realized that what had begun as a marriage of convenience was becoming something deeper and more precious. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. Ruby's time was drawing near, and Thomas had summoned Dr. Hartwell to stay at the ranch for the final weeks. The good doctor set up a temporary practice in the guest room, regaling them with stories of births he had attended across 3 territories. The labor began on a warm May morning when the apple trees were heavy with blossoms. Ruby bore the pain with the same quiet courage she had shown in every other aspect of her life, gripping Thomas's hand and finding strength in his steady presence. Dr. Hartwell worked with practiced efficiency, his experienced hands guiding the process with gentle skill. After what seemed like hours, but was probably less than one, the sound of a baby's cry filled the ranch house. Doctor Hartwell held up a small, red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival to the world with impressive volume. Thomas stared at the child in wonder, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Ruby reached weakly for the baby, and Dr. Hartwell placed the tiny bundle in her arms. The infant's crying stopped as soon as he felt his mother's touch, his dark eyes opening to stare up at the faces surrounding him. Ruby whispered his name, James Thomas Hawthorne, and Thomas felt his heart expand to accommodate this new love. The months that followed were the happiest of Thomas's life. Little James grew strong and healthy, his laughter filling the house that had been silent for too long. Ruby proved to be a devoted mother, singing lullabies in Spanish while she rocked the baby to sleep. Thomas discovered that he had not lost his touch with children, teaching James to ride by holding him on the saddle of their gentlest mare. The ranch prospered under Thomas's renewed energy and Ruby's careful management. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the cattle and expanded their herd with the profits from successful drives to market. Ruby planted a garden that produced enough vegetables to feed them through the winter with plenty left over to sell in town. As James took his first steps and spoke his first words, Thomas marveled at the way love had found him again when he least expected it. The child called him Papa without hesitation, having known no other father. Ruby had become not just his wife, but his partner in every sense, sharing his dreams and easing his burdens with her strength and wisdom. The townspeople of Deadwood Creek regarded the Hawthorne family with respect and affection. Thomas had become a man of influence in the community, serving on the town council and helping to establish the first proper school. Ruby organized the Church Ladies' Auxiliary and raised money for families in need, her own difficult past making her sensitive to others' struggles. On James's 2nd birthday, Thomas stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching his son chase butterflies in Ruby's garden while she hung laundry on the line. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that took his breath away. He thought of Mary and their lost child, no longer with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with gentle gratitude for the love they had shared. Ruby joined him on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling at the sight of James tumbling in the grass with their dog, a mongrel named Patch. She slipped her hand into Thomas's, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. They had never spoken the words aloud, but both knew that what had begun as a practical arrangement had grown into the deepest kind of love. Thomas turned to look at his wife, seeing past the young saloon girl he had rescued to the remarkable woman she had always been inside. Ruby met his gaze, with eyes that held no secrets, only the quiet confidence of a woman who knew she was cherished. In that moment, Thomas understood that saving Ruby had actually saved himself, giving him back the ability to hope and love and dream of the future. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas gathered his family close and felt the profound satisfaction of a man who had found his purpose. He had been a soldier, a rancher, and a grieving widower. But the role that suited him best was the one he had discovered almost by accident, husband to Ruby and father to James, protector of the small but precious kingdom they had built together. The frontier was a hard place that tested every man's character and resolve. Some men were broken by its challenges, others were hardened beyond recognition. But for Thomas Hawthorne, the wilderness had provided something unexpected, a second chance at happiness and the wisdom to recognize it when it appeared in the most unlikely form. Years later, when James had children of his own and the story of how his parents met had become family legend, he would tell his own sons about the importance of courage and compassion. He would speak of his father's transformation from silent grief to purposeful love, and of his mother's journey from desperate survival to dignified strength. The tale would be told around campfires and dinner tables, growing in the telling but never losing its essential truth, that sometimes salvation comes not from grand gestures or heroic deeds, but from the simple act of caring for another human being. In helping Ruby find safety and respect, Thomas had rediscovered his own capacity for joy. What do you think was the most important moment in Thomas's transformation from a grieving widower to a loving husband and father? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what you believe was the key to his redemption.